Cinderella, or the Little Glass Slipper, from the Blue Fairy Book. Once there was a gentleman who married, for his second wife, the proudest and most haughty woman that was ever seen. She had, by a former husband, 2 daughters of her own humor, who were indeed exactly like her in all things. He had likewise, by another wife, a young daughter, but of unparalleled goodness and sweetness of temper, which she took from her mother, who was the best creature in the world. No sooner were the ceremonies of the wedding over, but the mother-in-law began to show herself in her true colors. She could not bear the good qualities of this pretty girl, and the less because they made her own daughters appear more odious. She employed the meanest work of the house, and scoured the dishes and tables, and scrubbed Madame's chamber, and those of Mrs. her daughters. She lay up in a sorry garret, upon a wretched straw bed, while her sisters lay in fine rooms, with floors all inlaid, upon beds of the very newest fashion, and where they had looking-glasses so large that they might set themselves at their full length from head to foot. The poor girl bore all patiently, and dared not tell her father, who would have rattled her off, for his wife governed him entirely. When she had done her work, she used to go to the chimney-corner and sit down among the cinders and ashes, which made her commonly called Cinder Wench. But the youngest, who was not so rude and uncivil as the eldest, called her Cinderella. However, Cinderella, notwithstanding her mean apparel, was 100 times handsomer than her sisters, though they were always dressed very richly. Now, it happened that the king's son gave a ball, and invited all persons of fashion to it. The young misses were also invited, for they cut a very grand figure among the quality. They were mightily delighted at this invitation, and wonderfully busy in choosing out such gowns, petticoats, and head-clothes as might become them. This was a new trouble for Cinderella, for it was she who ironed the sisters' linen, plaited their ruffles, and they talked all day long of nothing but how they should be dressed. "For my part," said the oldest, "I will wear a red velvet suit with French trimming." "And I," said the youngest, "shall have my usual petticoat. But then, to make amends for that, I will put on a gold-flowered manteau, and my diamond stomacher, which is far from being the most ordinary one in the world." They sent for the best tire-women they could get to make up their headdresses, and adjust their double pinners, and they had their red brushes and patches from Mademoiselle de la Poche. Cinderella was likewise called up to them to be consulted in all these matters, for she had excellent notions, and advised them always for the best, nay, and offered her services to dress their heads, which they were very willing she should do. As she was doing this, they said to her, "Cinderella, would you not be glad to go to the ball?" "Alas," she said, "you only jeer me. It is not for such that I am to go there." "Thou art in the right of it all," they replied. "It would make people laugh to see a cinder wench at the ball." Anyone but Cinderella would have dressed their heads awry, but she was very good and dressed them perfectly well. They were almost 2 days without eating, so much they were transported with joy. They broke above a dozen laces in trying to get the laces to close up, and they might have been a fine slender shape, and they were continually at their looking glass. At last the happy day came, and they went to court, and Cinderella followed them with her eyes as long as she could, and when she had lost sight of them, she fell crying. Her godmother, who saw her all in tears, asked her what was the matter. I wish I could. I wish I could. She was not able to speak the rest, being interrupted by her tears and sobbing. Her godmother of hers, who was a fairy, said to her, "Thou wishest thou couldst go to the ball. Is it not so?" Yes, cried Cinderella with a great sigh. "Well," said her godmother, "be but a good girl, and I will contrive thou shalt go." Then she took her into the chamber and said to her, "Run into the garden and bring me a pumpkin." Cinderella went immediately to gather the finest she could get, and brought it to her godmother, not being able to imagine how this pumpkin could make her go to the ball. Her godmother scooped out all the inside of it, having left nothing but the rind, and when done, she struck it with her wand, and the pumpkin was instantly turned into a fine coach, gilded all over with gold. Shiny. She then went to look at her mouse trap. There she found 6 mice, all alive, and ordered Cinderella to lift up the little trap door, when giving each mouse as she went out a little tap with her wand. The mouse was that moment turned into a fine horse, and altogether made a very fine set of 6 horses, of a beautiful mousy dapple gray. Being at a loss for a coachman, "I will go and see," said Cinderella. "If there is never a rat in the rat trap, we may make a coachman of him." "Thou art in the right," replied her godmother. "Go and look." Cinderella brought the trap to her, and there were 3 large rats. The fairy made choice of one of the 3, which was the largest beard, and having touched him with her wand, he turned into a fat, jolly coachman, who had the smartest whiskers eyes had ever beheld. After that she said to her, "Go again to the garden. You will find 6 lizards behind the watering pot. Bring them to me." She had no sooner done so, but her godmother turned them into 6 footmen, who skipped up immediately behind the coach, with their liveries all bedaubed with gold and silver, and clung as close behind the other as they could get. They had nothing else to do with their lives. The fairy then said to Cinderella, "Well, you see here an equipage fit to go to the ball with. Are you not pleased with it?" "Oh, yes," she cried, "but I must go thither as I am, in these nasty rags." Her godmother only touched her with her wand, and at the same time her clothes were turned into cloth of gold and silver, all beset with jewels. This done, she gave her a pair of glass slippers, the prettiest in the whole world. Thus, being decked out, she got up into her coach, but her godmother, above all things, commanded her not to telling her at the same time that if she stayed one moment longer, the coach would be a pumpkin again, her horses mice, her coachman a rat, and her footmen lizards, and all her clothes just as they were before. Penguin. She promised her godmother she would not fail of leaving the ball before midnight. And then away she drives, scarce able to contain herself for joy. The king's son, who was told that a great princess whom nobody knew was coming, and ran out to receive her. He gave her his hand, and she alighted out of the coach, and led her into the ball among all the company. There she was immediately in a profound silence. They left off dancing, and the violin ceased to play, so attentive was everyone to contemplate the singular beauties of the unknown newcomer. Nothing was heard but a confused noise of "Oh, how handsome she is! Oh, how handsome she is!" Thank you for the 4 months, Papa Penguin. The king himself, as old as he was, could not help watching her and telling the queen softly that it has been a long time since he has seen such a beautiful and lovely creature. At which he elbowed him. All the ladies were busied in concerning her clothes and headdress, that they might have some day made the next day after the same pattern, provided they could meet with such fine material and able hands to make them. The king's son conducted her to the most honorable seat, and afterward took her out to dance with him. She danced so gracefully that after all more and more admired her. A fine collation was served up, wherefore the prince ate not a morsel, so intently was he busied gazing on her. She went and sat down by her sisters, showing them 1,000 civilities, giving them part of the oranges and citrons which the prince has presented with her, which very much surprised them, for they did not know her. While Cinderella was thus amusing her sisters, she heard the clock strike 11 3/4, whereupon she immediately made a curtsy to the company and hasted away as fast as she could. Being got home, she ran to seek out her godmother. After having thanked her, she said that she could not but heartily wish she might go the next day to the ball, because the king's son desired her to. As she was eagerly telling her godmother whatever had passed at the ball, her 2 sisters knocked at the door, which Cinderella ran and opened. "How long have you stayed?" she cried, gaping, rubbing her eyes and stretching herself, as if she had just waked herself out of sleep. She hadn't. She didn't want to give any manner of inclination to sleep as they went from home. "If thou hast been to the ball," said one of her sisters, "thou wouldst not have been tired with it. There came thither the finest princess, the most beautiful ever was seen both mortal eyes. She showed us 1,000 civilities, and gave us orange and citrons." Cinderella seemed very indifferent in the matter. Indeed, she asked them the name of that princess, but they told her they did not know it, and that the king's son was very uneasy on her account and would give all the world to know who she was. After this, Cinderella smiled, replying, "She must then be very beautiful indeed. How happy you have been! Could not I see her? Ah, dear Miss Charlotte, do lend me your yellow suit of clothes which you wear every other day." "Ay, to be sure!" cried Miss Charlotte. "Lend my clothes to such a dirty cinder wench as thou art! I should be a fool." Cinderella indeed expected well such an answer, and was very glad to the refusal, for she would have been sadly put to it if her sisters had lent her what she had asked in jest. The next day the two sisters were at the ball, and so was Cinderella, but dressed more magnificently than before. The king's son was always by her, and never ceased his compliments and kind speeches to her, to whom all of this was so far from being tiresome that she quite forgot what her grandmother had recommended to her. So at last she counted the clock striking 12. When she took it to be no more than 11. When she rose up and fled, nimble as a deer. The prince followed, but could not overtake her. She left behind one of her glass slippers, which the prince took up most carefully. She got home, but quite out of breath, and her nasty old clothes having nothing left her of her finery but one of the glass slippers. Fellow to that she dropped. The guards at the palace gate were asked if they had not seen the princess go out, who said they had seen nobody go out but a young girl, very meanly dressed, and who had more an air of poor country wench than of a gentlewoman. When the two sisters returned from the ball, Cinderella asked them if they had been well diverted, and if the fine lady had been there. They told her yes, but she hurriedly away immediately when it struck 12, and with such haste that she dropped one of her little glass slippers, the prettiest in the world, which the king's son had taken up. He had done nothing but look at her all the time at the ball, and most certainly he was very much in love with this beautiful person who owned the glass slipper. What they said was very true, for a few days after the king's son caused it to be proclaimed, by a sound of trumpet, that he would marry her whose foot the slipper would just fit. They whom he employed began to try it upon princesses, then the duchesses, and all the court, but in vain. It was brought to the two sisters, who did all they possibly could to thrust their feet into the slipper, but they could not effect it. Cinderella, who saw this, and knew her slipper, said it to them, laughing, "Let me see if it will not fit me." Her sisters burst out laughing and began to banter her. The gentleman who was sent to try the slipper looked earnestly at Cinderella, and, finding her very handsome, said it was but just that she should try, and that he had orders to let everyone make trial. He obliged Cinderella to sit down, and putting the slipper to her foot, he found it went on very easily, and fitted her as if it had been made of wax. The astonishment her two sisters were in was excessively great, but still abundantly greater when Cinderella pulled out of her pocket the other slipper and put it on her foot. Thereupon in came her godmother, who, having touched with her wand Cinderella's clothes, made them richer and more magnificent than any of those she had before. And now her two sisters found her to be that fine, beautiful lady whom they had seen at the ball, and threw themselves at her feet to beg pardon at all the ill treatments they had made her undergo. Cinderella took them up, and she embraced them and cried. She forgave them with all her heart, and desired them to always love her. She conducted to the young prince, and, dressed as she was, and he thought her more charming than ever, and a few days after married her. Cinderella, who was no less good than beautiful, gave her two sisters lodgings at the palace, and that very same day matched them with two great lords of the court.